Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
This week's Haftarah can be found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 54, verses 1 to 10. It's a relatively short Haftarah. These verses are part of a prophecy the prophet Isaiah said to the people of Israel during a time when they were exiled in Babylon. At this point, they made it to the promised land only to be driven out. It was a time when many of them might have had trouble keeping faith in God. It was easy for them to feel quite small during. So God, through Isaiah, tells them, enlarge the size of your tent, extend the size of your dwelling. And of course, this is referring to the Israelites taking back their territory. But today, the world we live in is not as black and white. Not every people have a country to themselves. As Jews are lucky enough to have Israel, not everybody can say the same. So what about us? We don't live in Israel. What constitutes our dwelling? And because I am still learning people's names, and because I don't want to discriminate against those that I don't remember the names of in favor of those that I do remember, when I point to you, even if I do know your name, I'm just going to say it anyway. Helps me out, and as a teacher of little kids, makes me feel more at home. So again, what constitutes a dwelling for you as an individual? And maybe we'll open it up a little bit to a more larger view.
So that answer has changed a lot over my life, and I'm sure it helps for everybody. When I was younger, the dwelling was wherever my parents were, right? That was where I dwelled, whether that was home or even if we were on vacation. Where my parents were was their home. At college, it was the dorm room. And then in the Navy, it was literally just wherever I had to bed to sleep is where I slept, right? Like, to be in the middle of the ocean, you could be in a country you've never been to, and it's wherever you laid your head, that was your dwelling. And now, it's where my wife is. So I think what your dwelling is changes with time, and you kind of need to accept it.
Thank you, Josh. So a dwelling can change. I love that. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Oh, over here. Oh, Rabbi.
So, I was compelled by Josh's answer to think about how when I was young, there was a time where the dwelling didn't even mean that much to me. I was always looking to get out, to be with friends, to go to a show, to go to a bar, to whatever, right? Like it was a place to be, but it was a place to be that I could locate myself so I could live the life that I wanted to live, which was largely defined as being outside the house. But as I got older, and especially as I got married, it became more important to me to have a place in which both of us were very comfortable and that we could enjoy spending time together, as well as perhaps welcoming others into our lives as a couple, right? But it became much more meaningful to me over time than it was in my younger days, I would say.
Thank you, Rabbi. I want to flip this question on its head for a minute, and let's think instead of places that are not our dwelling. What makes you feel unwelcome in these places? Because a dwelling doesn't have to necessarily be the place where you sleep. It can be anywhere that you feel welcome, at home, accepted. For example, many of us feel like this synagogue can be our dwelling. It's our community that we have incorporated as a part of ourselves, our identity. But those places that we don't consider our dwelling, what specifically about them makes us feel that way about them? Why can't we consider them our dwelling? And this might be different for certain people. Yeah. Thank you, Phil.
Attitudes of the people within. I can walk in a house and feel somebody else's house. It feels very warm and inviting. I can walk in another person's house and the clutter, and there's just something there that just doesn't give me warmth. I feel uninvited even though the person has invited me. And I think it has a sense of, it could be the layout of the house or the place, or it could be just the people within that just are not welcoming.
Thank you. So one person can find a dwelling perfectly suitable, and another might not. If I invited Phil over to my house, I am perfectly happy in that house. It's my dwelling. It's terribly cluttered. I don't care. But if Phil came over, she wouldn't be welcome there, would she? She wouldn't feel that. So perhaps when we invite others into our dwelling, we have to consider how they might feel about it. Anybody else? Josh?
So this has been an issue, especially since I was in the military, but also now since I've been teaching culture, if you go somewhere, like there's a party, right, that you're invited to, and they don't have any food that you can, right, like when everything that's there is pepperoni and supreme pizzas, that's not super welcome. You don't feel like you really belong there. Like they didn't consider, and they're different. Like sometimes, the people will consider, but they don't know, right? They don't know what a Haftarah is. They don't know. So they try, and that's not unwelcoming, it's just kind of unfortunate. But then you get things where it's like, really, guys, like, you should know I don't do that. And that's much more.
Definitely something I can understand as somebody with a bunch of dietary restrictions. Thank you. So God tells the Israelites, enlarge your dwelling. And the Israelites were an oppressed people back then, as they are now. They were kicked out of the promised land and sent to Babylon. Now, when you are an oppressed people, a minority especially, and someone tells you to expand the size of your dwelling, there are different ways you can go about that. Here are a few that I thought of. Let me know, please, if you could think of others. The obvious one is to fight back, take back what's yours. You could negotiate, see if maybe you can share or divide it evenly somehow. You could also escape to a place where you're not as oppressed. Of course, you can always do nothing. Am I missing any? All right, so given those choices, the next verse of the Haftarah actually tells them which option God favored in this case for the Israelites. The next verse says, you shall spread out left and right, yamin usmol, and your offspring shall dispossess nations. Now this is a verse, it's echoed a few times in different words throughout the Torah and rest of the Jewish Bible. I gotta say, I'm not super comfortable with it. Now, dispossessing nations, it can really get to you if you see the person that you're dispossessing. Now, in the case of the Israelites and the Babylonians, you could argue that it would be okay to dispossess them because they were the ones who picked out the Israelites in the first place. But let's pretend for a moment that the people that you are asked to dispossess don't have any prior relationship with you, but you might need to do it just to allow your people to survive. By a show of hands, who would be comfortable doing this? All right, in that case, assuming everybody disagrees, why might you not want to do it? So what are the circumstances that would convince you to change your mind? Josh?
If they give you something, is to like me out, me and my people out. That would be certainly adequate grounds for, defense.
I gotta say, people are often surprised by what others will do when their backs are against the wall. I think everybody has principles, but some people break them when they feel that it's life or death. Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I was just thinking that perhaps somebody who would not respect my opinion, and it has to be their way or no way, I certainly wouldn't want to have anything to do with that particular person or that belief.
Of course. Thank you, Phil. So the very next verse in the Haftarah says, "Fear not, you shall not be shamed. Do not cringe, you shall not be disgraced." And the general interpretation of this verse is that the Israelites shouldn't fear that they're going to die without a land of their own. They're going to get it back. But I wonder if anybody might interpret this verse differently. Again, the verse says, "Fear not, you shall not be shamed. Do not cringe, you shall not be disgraced." Anybody have a different interpretation of those words? Josh?
I do, but I feel like I'm talking.
Well, when you're the only one raising your hand, you are more than welcome to speak.
So you could read that as focusing on the "you shall not be disgraced," especially, could indicate that don't worry about reaching your moral reservations. You will be justified in the eyes of God and the eyes of other nations, whether that's because the nation you're dispossessing, however you happen to do that, is a truly evil one, right? I believe elsewhere in the Torah describes some of these tribes engaged in child sacrifice, which is certainly not a thing that should be allowed to continue. So maybe it's a reassurance that when the nations that will be dispossessed are predicated on belief systems and practices that need to be eradicated.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, that was my thought too. I think this verse, Rabbi.
So I think that's a really good interpretation. I actually think it's also possible to interpret it almost exactly the opposite way, which is the great thing about a text that's so elastic and flexible and fluid. I think also sometimes it can mean I don't have to have the last word. I don't actually have to beat somebody down or make fun of them or whatever. I don't need to displace them or replace them because my sense of self should not be dependent on another person. That is, they can't really disgrace me in a sense unless I want to be disgraced or allow myself to be disgraced. But if I have a strong enough core in who I am, and if I am a person of faith, then I shouldn't necessarily feel that somebody else's negativity actually does bring me down, right? I shouldn't necessarily feel that way. So I almost feel like you will not be disgraced. It's like you don't have to go and take charge or be the last person standing to feel good. You should actually feel good for other ways.
Great. So Josh thought, and this was a thought that I had too, that it was related to the previous verse, that you should not feel ashamed of dispossessing other nations. Mm-hmm. You had to do it. I commanded you to, for one thing, and also they were not so nice to you. Don't be ashamed of doing what you have to do to get your dignity. But Rabbi, I really like what Rabbi said. Do you really have to do that in the first place? Do you have to Do you have to take away from others in order to get what you need for yourself? Can we find our own way to accept what's happening without having to really derive our gains from other people's losses? And I think that's a big part of what America was in concept, was a place where everybody originally could feel accepted. And I speak of America because in a moment we're going to be talking about some current events, but I have one more question before we get to that. The Haftarah also says this week, God promises that he will not abandon the Israelites. He says, in slight anger, for a moment, I hid my face from you, but with kindness everlasting, I will take you back in love. For me, this is like the waters of Noah. As I swore to Noah that I would never again flood the earth, so I swear that I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. Now, the High Holy Day season is upon us. We are in Elul, and it is time that we think about promises that we've kept, promises that we haven't kept. That's the theme of Kol Nidrei, Erev Yom Kippur. And I know that not everybody feels comfortable criticizing God, but I do believe that it is okay to question God if we do it out of a place of respect. So if we think hypothetically for a moment, if God promises us something, or if anybody promises us something, it doesn't have to be God. If they go back on their promise briefly, only to make it up to you later, how might that make you feel? If God promises us, for example, the land of Israel, only for us to go through this cycle of belonging and expulsion and reclamation all over again, how would that make us feel? Or rather, is there something, if somebody promises you something and then somebody else acts disgracefully, or you act disgracefully, would that be grounds to go back on your promise? For example, God promises us the land of Israel. The Israelites, the Jews, they act terribly according to the Torah. And then they get expelled, and they are to come back later. This terrible behavior, this disrespect for God, is apparently grounds for removal despite the promise. Is that okay? Is that really a God that keeps his word? Is it okay because we were wrong? And I'm actually happy that nobody's raising their hand, because this is not something that we want to say out loud, because we don't want our thoughts about this to influence those of others. Our opinion of God is our own, but at the same time, it's something to think about. And I think we can even give our opinion if we are still respectful of those others who might disagree with us. Esther, I think I saw your hand.
Earlier in the Torah, it says, once you make a promise, you have to do it, and you have to do it as soon as you possibly can. If you wait, you incur guilt. So if God is going to make a promise to us, God wants to fulfill the promise as soon as God possibly can. Well, God incurs guilt. By our own rule.
So God, it seems, is not playing by the same rules that are established for us. Interesting. I might question, and thank you, Esther, I think I might agree with you. That's just our opinion. I might question, because God is God and we are mere mortals, is that an excuse for God to have a different rule book than mortals do? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's something to think about. Now I want to talk quickly about the events that happened this week in Afghanistan, because I feel that this Haftarah section has a lot of parallels. As a quick rule of thumb, I don't want to play the blame game. I don't want to be rude to any party. I don't want to have this be something where we get super political, which is why the question I'm going to ask you, I hope that you answer, perhaps not from your own perspective, but from the perspective of somebody else whom you might disagree on. Somebody who could have a logical argument, but with whom you still don't agree. That is, we are going to play town hall, and we are going to pretend that we have a diverse array of opinions in this crowd, even though perhaps we actually don't. I might not know. So these three sections: enlarge your tent, you may dispossess nations, you may don't feel shame, and also this is like the waters of Noah to me. I promised it, I won't go back on it. I want to focus on three groups: the Taliban, the rest of the Afghan people, and the commanders of the American military. And you can comment on any of those three: the Taliban, the rest of the Afghans, or the commanders of the military here in America. What parts of the verses that we went over in this Haftarah might have a parallel connection to these events, and for which group? I will give, Josh, go ahead.
So, I think you're missing a group.
Oh, by all means, that one.
The now former leadership of Afghanistan, as opposed to the Afghan people themselves, because the president, vice president, and other leadership generals in Afghanistan, like the Afghan president and generals, were definitely a very different group than the Afghan people themselves.
All right, so I will definitely include them. Thank you. Always happy to take the word of somebody who's worked with the military when it comes to military matters. So if we're going to focus then on that group, Josh, which verses in the Haftarah this week would you feel apply to them?
Well, I feel like they did not expand their text. They, at a fundamental level, I think they actually strengthened. I don't know how much you know about the situation, but the military forces in Afghanistan were, in a large part, only on paper, right? Like, literally hundreds of thousands of troops that just did not exist except to fill the pockets of some of these generals. So I feel like they failed to expand their tent. They failed to bring in Afghan people in a meaningful way. They failed to bridge the divide between the tribes there and form a working, democratic, forward-thinking, inclusive coalition.
Thank you. Absolutely. And we don't have to necessarily agree 100% with what Josh said, but I feel that most of what he said can be considered factual. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong. Now, let's take the Taliban. They did expand their tent, and the Muslims have the same commandment: expand your tent, although the wording is slightly different. What about the verse, do not have shame? Fear not, you shall not be disgraced. Which group, there might be more than one, would that apply to? Yeah. So,
They're tribes and clans, as you say. It's a different outlook, a different way of looking at way of living. And we never did achieve that in 20 years.
very true. Now, are you saying that the Afghan people should not be ashamed or that the US military should not be ashamed? Or are you saying that both of them should not be ashamed? Because the verse says, fear not, you shall not be shamed. All right, well, you could argue, if we say as you do, and this is just an opinion, that what we came to do in Afghanistan was an impossible task, then perhaps we shouldn't be ashamed that we didn't complete it. Others would disagree, and that's fine too. On the other hand, we could say that if we live in Afghanistan and we are just a family, if we're a child and our country was just taken over by the Taliban, it's not my fault. I'm a little kid. Don't be ashamed. Well, there are lots of questions that are still being asked. And my goal here today is not to assign blame or to answer all of the unknowns, but simply to draw parallels between today's Haftarah and the situation on the ground. But you're absolutely right. There's still a lot of questions. What about the verse, for me, this is like the waters of Noah. I swore that I would never again flood the earth. So I swear that I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. God is referring to a promise that he made to Noah. How might this relate? Esther. All right, so we go back again to that promise of Israel. We had it and then we didn't. We had it and then we didn't. The cycle goes on and on and on. Some of us might feel that that promise wasn't kept. And there are some regarding Afghanistan that might feel that we as Americans made a promise to them that was not kept when we left. Now, I will not say if I feel that or not. I am only saying that I have read that many of the Afghani people feel abandoned by the Americans. Yeah, Esther?
But it took several hundred years. If you're going to build a nation, you have to, ahead of time, make the decision. We're going to be here for 5 whole generations and do everything.
Right. Right, thank you, Esther. And I want to say that, again, my goal here is not to name or blame people or parties, but just to show that the Haftarah, we are running out of time. Josh, is it quick? I'm happy to call on you if it's quick. Just want to say that, while you are always welcome to any opinion you might have, I want to show that the Torah can be interpreted to fit any opinion from any side, because that's just how flexibly the Torah can be interpreted. So you might think it means X, somebody else might think it means Y, and some people might say, what is the point of a document that is so unclear that it can be interpreted every which way? What's the point? But for me, that's what makes the Torah so beautiful, is that no matter what you think or what you believe, the Torah can be an aid and a comfort to you, both historically, when you think about the situation that was happening to the Israelites in Babylon, and even today. So as we read more about the military campaigns of the Israelites, I'd like to see how many parallels we can draw between then and now. Thank you.